All questions answered and advice given. Welcome to Strong for Life Live. This is Coach Josh Wood down here in Hobart, Tasmania, and it's a different day of the week. It's Friday because I was in the mountains on Tuesday. So it's 2:49 on the 4th of August. Different day, different episode style. So, I started off with a statement. All questions answered and advice given. And there is a story to this. So first of all, this is a Q&A episode, and questions were submitted through the Become Strong for Life Facebook group, where we do most of our community conversation. And I wanted to know what people didn't really understand about health and fitness or about training. So I've got a handful of good questions here. I will try to answer them in the most concise way I can, and then we can follow up on another Q&A episode or within the group. So some good questions, but first, a story. All questions answered and advice given. When I was 18, I was almost done with high school, and I bought myself a backpack and a one-way ticket to Ireland, with the goal of wandering until I couldn't wander anymore. One of my first stops was in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where I spent about a month. And during that time, as part of my coming-of-age adventures, I spent some time busking. And at the time, I didn't have any real skills. 18-year-old, fresh out of high school, nowhere to go, no plans, no money, no real skills. At a later point in my life, I did spend a fair bit of time busking in Canada, playing Irish music on the tin whistle. At this point, I didn't have that skill. So I was like, what can I do? How can I make money? Because you have to have money to go anywhere. And so what I did is I found an old plank of wood, and I made a sign, and I found milk crate. I don't think they make soap boxes anymore. It was a milk crate. And I put myself out in front of a shopping center. And I put up my sign and I sat on my milk crate. My sign said, all questions answered and advice given for £1. And I spent some time answering questions and giving advice to the best of my capacity. And that was a very memorable experience during my early life grand adventures. So that's where that actual story comes from, where that phrase comes from. Now, this isn't a podcast about my life. This is a podcast to answer your questions and make sure that you come away with some answers or some answers and some more good questions. So let's just take a quick look here. I've got a list. That way I don't forget anything or anyone. Let's start with the question from Pauline. So Pauline is actually part of the Lean for Life 2023 weight loss challenge. And she has a good question. To build muscle or lose weight, what do I need to do? Is it about heavier lifting or doing more reps? Am I better lifting as heavy as possible and struggling to meet reps, or go lighter and do an extra set? This is primarily with the perspective of trying to build muscle. Okay, so her question is about what is the best option if I'm trying to build muscle? Basically, more reps or more weight, as opposed to would there be a difference if it was about weight loss? So good question. You hear this a lot, and it depends. This will always be my answer. It depends. It's one of those nuanced topics. So let's say, in general, if you are trying to build muscle, you need to be working between, let's say, 6 and 30 repetitions per set, working within 2 to 3 reps of failure consistently, basically all the time. And then you have to recover from that, which means you need to be sleeping, managing your stress, and eating appropriately. So if you want to build muscle, you have to be in a calorie surplus because you are building tissue. So that means whatever you decide to do, you need to be working between 5 and 30 reps at 2 to 3 in reserve, so near failure, consistently and ongoing. If the weight is lighter, Then you'll be able to do more reps and you'll probably recover better. Volume is important. So you can gain just as much muscle mass lifting heavy. You can gain just as much lifting lighter if you're in that rep range. The problem is the mass is more so related to the volume, and that's just a few mechanisms. I'm going to try not to go too far into this, but if we just say that the amount of tension that you put your muscles under is probably one of the key factors in triggering muscle growth, we call it hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is the growing of tissue. We need to put the muscles under tension, and we need that tension to be of a certain length of time. And so if you do a set of 30, and if you're doing it properly, when you're nearly hitting failure close to 30 reps, that's a very long time. It's very easy to hit failure or close to failure lifting really heavy for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reps. So the problem is the more time you put your muscles under tension, the bigger the stimulus for muscle growth. So you can do it with heavy, but you're going to have to do a lot of sets, which means a lot of rest in between because you are fatigued quite heavily from heavy lifting. Whereas you could do 3 sets of 15 to near failure, and it'll be hard, and you'll feel the burn. But you probably only need 2 minutes rest in between. And you can do that consistently. Whereas to get those same 45 reps at the right amount of tension, how many sets of 5 are you going to do? You can do 9 sets of 5? So equating for volume is tricky. Getting the right stimulus is not too terribly hard. The hard part is eating accordingly. So if you are in a weight loss phase and you have a significant amount of fat to lose, and you are, let's say, a beginner lifter, you can undergo what's called body recomposition, where you are actually consuming your fat stores as energy, and that energy that you need being taken from your storage can then be used to feed the growth process. And so this is what we typically see with new people who are new to lifting, and they're not necessarily in a surplus, they're in a deficit on the books, but they're consuming their body fat. And what happens is you see them get smaller, get stronger, but the scales might stay the same, or they might even go down a little bit. But generally, the scales stay about the same as the waist shrinks, as the person shrinks, and the strength goes up because you're losing fat while simultaneously gaining muscle. This really only happens to any significant degree with new trainees. So, long story short, I would suggest basically keeping your reps between 10 and 20 for 2 to 4 sets for almost everything. If your goal is to build some muscle, build some decent work capacity, and lose some fat. Ultimately, the change in weight is dictated by your calories. So calories are units of energy. If you want to lose weight, you have to be in a deficit. And that could be because you're eating less or because you're exercising more. If you're trying to lean up, having more energy expenditure by doing more work is probably the way to go, which means more sets, more reps, more total volume of training. So if we look at, say, you're lifting 10 kilos 45 times, 450 kilos, that's a lot of volume. Whereas if you're only lifting, 100 kilos for 3 singles, well, it's still 300 kilos. So the total volume of workload is less with strength training typically. So for most people, unless you're really focused in a strength sport, I would go moderate to high reps with moderate to lightish weights, taking that near failure, focusing on eating a very large amount of protein and keeping your calories at maintenance or at deficit to lose that fat and still gain some muscle mass. But what most people want to see is visible muscle. They want to see muscle as opposed to, I don't know. People are always like, I want to build muscle. And you can have heaps of muscle under your body fat, but if you can't see it, what is it doing for you? It can be very functional, but ultimately most people, when they say they want to build muscle, means they want to see muscle. Some people will confuse this with toning, which is not a real thing, but just basically means you want to have visible mass. You want to see the curvature of the shoulders and the bicep, and you might want to see a bit of definition in the thighs. That visible muscle mass is what most people are after. And the number one way to have visible muscle mass is to lose body fat that's covering it. So I hope that's not too complex or too question raising, but if you do have more questions on that topic, we might have to go into a full depth podcast on that topic. It's a big one. Now, we have a question from Dave, and Dave asks about periodization. Periodization is a fairly complex term. It's a little bit more advanced. Most people don't look at periodization when it comes to your average personal trainer or your average gym session. Periodization doesn't usually come into the picture. Basically, periodization is just broadly referring to training that is structured around periods of progressive loading and training stress followed by rest. The whole idea is to prevent burnout and plateaus, to prevent injury. We're just basically looking at how programming is structured over long periods of time, and we can break that into macro at the big ends, mesocycles, and then microcycles. So different units of time that we program over. And so periodization is any time that we're looking at basically changing our programming over time to accommodate recovery. It's all about fatigue management. And so it would be something like if I'm planning 12 weeks for a strength test, let's say a powerlifting meet, programming different levels of intensity, ramping up the strength component. So slowly over time, ramping up we call this peaking, ramping up the amount of high intensity, low volume training. So lifting heavy that we do over time comes up, it tapers up, it peaks, and then we accommodate for rest prior to testing. In hypertrophy training, it would be periods of increasing intensity, working through 3 in reserve, 2, 1 in reserve, max out, deload. That's periodization. So changing the intensity and rest over time to make sure we're not running into burnout, plateaus, or injury. So it's a fairly advanced thing with programming because you're looking at long time periods. I do most of my hypertrophy training in 4 to 6 week blocks with planned deloads. I like that system a lot. I do a lot of strength programming over 3 to 6 months. I've got Gemma. She's one of my running athletes, former powerlifter, now runner. I've programmed hers over like 30 weeks. So just over 6 months, looking at how she's going to be recovering and hitting certain volumes of running for an upcoming half marathon up a mountain. So that's just the general idea of periodization. It's essentially just how we manage training load and fatigue over a time period. And there's a bunch of other jargon and things we get into, but I don't probably need to go into that. So if you do have questions, again, shoot me a message, drop a comment. If you want me to go over this stuff in more depth, happy to, but it'll take time. Okay, so that's muscle gain. We had periodization. Haley asks when to deload. Oh boy. Deloading you kind of bring in as part of periodization if you're planning in advance. If we don't have planned deloads, you basically have to look at your recovery, and then you would deload when your recovery is suffering. So let's say you've been training last year. Last year I did a 16-week strength progression. I used a 5-3-1 template using percentages of my 1 rep max to train up for a strongman competition. And I hadn't done any focused strength training like that in years since I powerlifted. Probably been 6 years at that point. But I had somebody that I needed to beat. So I was like, okay, I'm going to plan this out. And so I took the deloads out of a program that I would normally do, saving me 3 weeks, I guess, when I usually do that at the end of a 4th or 5th week. And then that system really pushed my ability to recover. But I did it, and I progressed pretty much every single week But then I had to take 2 weeks off training before I was functional again. So that was sort of forced deload. Generally, we deload either in advance, which has its pros and cons. If we have planned deloads, you may get to a deload period and you don't need it. You could push through and get better gains, whether that's muscle growth or that's strength gains. If you are not an athlete, I almost always do planned deloads because you're not on a timeline. Your timeline is forever. Your timeline is life. So we cut deloads when they're not necessary or don't plan for them if we're not on a strict timeline. But ultimately, if you had a coach standing over your shoulder every day, watching how you train, looking at your exercise readiness metrics, so how sore you are, how well you're sleeping, what your energy level is, your mood, how you're recovering, that whole recovery picture. And we start to see that you're not making as much progress as we would like to see, whether it's increased reps or weight, or we're starting to see more signs of accumulating fatigue. You're just sore all the time, you're grumpy, you're not sleeping great, you never feel energetic. All those would tell me that you need a deload. And that deload can be something like just take a week off, go walking. And so my powerlifters always have them take a week off where they have just a couple set time periods for the gym where they can do whatever they want and a lot of walking. That's one way. Alternatively, you could do a 50% deload, do all your movements at 50% reps or 50% weight. I like to keep the weight a little higher and the reps low because volume can be very fatiguing, especially at higher weights if you're a strength athlete or higher percentages of 1 rep max. There's a lot of ways to deload, but ultimately it's whenever you're not recovering well. That's the long and short of it. Okay, so we've covered periodization, we've covered muscle gain. We've done deload. Danielle asked about muscle recovery and soreness. So muscle soreness after training or after exercise is called DOMS, D-O-M-S, delayed onset muscle soreness. This is a normal thing anytime you have been exposed or your muscles have been exposed to novel stimulus. And novel stimulus just means you did something new. So this can happen for a few reasons. If you're new to training, boy, you're going to be sore. Especially if you do hypertrophy work, a lot of just muscle building work. You are going to be sore. And you're going to be sore for a long time. Probably 4, 5, 6 days. If you're really untrained, and this could be because you're new, or because you've been detrained, meaning you've taken a long period off, or it could be because you're doing a new style of training. All those things are considered novel stimulus. They're new things for your body to adapt to. The worst thing you can do in that situation is, on your first session back, destroy yourself, and then have to take a week off, and then go and do it again. The time in between is too long. Your body's not going to adapt well that way. If you go too hard and you take too much time off, it's going to be a really slow process to get back into it because the more time between sessions and the harder you go, the more sore you're going to be. The more your body is going to consider that novel or new stimulus because if you take a week or two between workouts, it's not consistent enough for your body to adapt. So the best thing you can do to deal with that is have consistent, moderate workouts and slowly increase your intensity over time as you adapt to them. But anytime you start new training, you're probably going to be sore. And if you've had really strenuous training, if you're trying to build maximal muscle mass, you're going to be sore a lot. But you shouldn't be crippled. You should be seeking slightly novel stimulus, which means slightly more time under tension, slightly more reps, slightly more weight. Always pushing something that leaves you feeling a little tender, a little sore, but not, oh my God, I can't stand up sore. Because that prevents you from doing further training, which means you're ultimately doing less training and seeing less results in the long run. Because training effects are cumulative. You want to do as much as possible over time. The individual workout doesn't work. If you can do one hard workout a week and you destroy yourself in an hour or less, or you could do 3 moderate workouts at 45 minutes to an hour, you're almost tripling the amount of work you're doing and recovering from it well and able to do it again the next week. And so over time, it's like putting pennies in a jar. That accumulates. So You will be sore when you do new things, and every time there's a change in intensity or the type of training, new exercises, you will continue to be sore. If you are sore a lot and consistently, there is a mismatch between your training intensity and your ability to recover. If you were Wolverine on a 10,000 calorie diet, you could recover from anything, and then you'd basically be lifting as much as possible, as often as possible. But we can't do that. And especially if you're a busy parent or professional and you have a lot of work or a lot of home responsibilities, your recovery is going to suffer, and you have to find that balance. But if you're perpetually sore and aching, and not just a little tender in the muscles you've trained, and that extends for more than a couple days, there's a mismatch, and that's something that you're going to need to sort out. Whether you can get in touch, and I'll point you in the right direction, or talk to your PT or your coach or someone. But you shouldn't be perpetually sore. So definitely look into that if that's the case. Okay, moving along. All right, great question from Gemma, the runner I just mentioned previously. So this is the last question, unless something pops up here in the feed. Gemma asks what the perfect training split is. So let's define training split. A training split is how you split up your workouts across a week. So a standard training split for a newbie or intermediate would be a full body training session 2 to 4 times a week. You do legs, you do back, you do chest, you push, you do pull. Great. Another common one is push-pull legs. You do a day of pushing, things like bench and overhead press. You do a day of pulling, your rows and your lat pull downs, and then you do a day of leg training. Another one would be a push-pull day, a push-pull day, and a leg day. Or you could have a 5 to 7 day split where it's body part. You do, let's say, back and biceps one day, and then you do chest and triceps, and then you do a posterior chain day and like an anterior chain day, and then you do an arm specific day. Like you can split by body part as well. There is no perfect training split because everything comes down to accumulating as much stimulus for the outcomes you want as often as you can and still recover from it. If you can't recover, well, you can't do anything then, because that's when you build muscle. It's when you're recovering. That's when you gain the results of your training. So your training split will depend on what you want to accomplish and what you can recover from. Newbies have great recovery. Intermediates have great recovery. You could do a full day split, 1 hour workout, where you do, say, some sort of squat, some sort of hinge, a push and a pull, and then maybe a bit of core work. 5 to 6 exercises takes you about an hour. You could do that 3 to 4 times a week and recover well, depending on intensity level, depending on your recovery, because of everything else in your life. The best training split is the one you can do. Some people do great on 3 workouts a week. Some people need the stimulus of 6 or 7 to see results. And this is breaking into training age. Training age is sort of dictated by how linearly you are improving. Newbies improve like this. Every week, they're lifting more weight, gaining more mass, putting more reps on the bar, putting more reps in. Awesome. So newbies gain like this. That's a young training age. The more advanced your training age, the more that line looks like this. Your intermediates might not see rep or weight changes every week, but maybe every 2 weeks, every training cycle. Advanced athletes take way more stimulus, way more work to see the smallest gain. This is why you'll see professional strength athletes spend a year and try to put 5 kilos on the bar, whereas a newbie is putting 5-10 kilos on the bar on their deadlift every week. So training age is how adapted to training you are. The more adapted you are, the more advanced your training age, the more stimulus and more tiny little details matter. That's why high-level bodybuilders will do a full day just arms, because it takes a week for a body part to recover so they could hit it again. Because if it's not recovered well, hitting it again is not going to help. Which kind of brings me back to the soreness question, because that's one way to sort of judge how recovered you are. If you are sore going into a workout and you feel better once you start moving, you're doing great. If you start to feel worse, you're probably better off taking a rest. The other thing is, if you are incredibly sore, you're not going to perform well. So one of the things we know is that muscles that are in pain will not contract to their full potential. You can push through that, and through a good warm-up, you will get them firing well. And if the goal is volume, say you're doing glute training, like my booty building pilot team that we're working with right now, your glutes can handle a ton of volume. You could train them 4 to 6 days a week and they recover really well. Some muscles don't do as well. Some people don't do as well. And if you're perpetually sore, you're not getting as quality of workout as you need. You're not getting the quality volume and stimulus over time. It all comes back around recovery. And training splits are just a way to manage that across a week, making sure each body part or movement is recovered well enough for you to create that stimulus again and build as opposed to break down. So I hope all of those weren't too jargony, and we did that in pretty good time. So we talked about muscle gain versus fat loss and rep ranges. We looked at periodization. We looked at deloads, muscle recovery and soreness, and training splits. And they all kind of feed together into understanding programming and how to better put your own programs together, or understand how coaches put programs together. So if you have any questions about this stuff, feel free to hit me up, drop a comment. You can shoot me an email from our new website, strongforlife.online, Strong for Life jeez, I can't remember my own handles. Strong for Life online coaching on Instagram, and Coach Josh Wood on Instagram. Just hit me up or one of the team members and we can get you some answers. So once again, Coach Josh Wood here in Hobart, Tasmania. This has been Strong for Life Live. And you know what? Have a good weekend.